What with the current crop of latest mega bikes that have just been released, including the Tarmac and the Emonda and the Madone, I thought I'd do a little video and more of an overview and a truthful in-depth analysis. Unfortunately, my business model doesn't rely on paid promotions and paid reviews from the big brands, so I can say whatever I like and I can drill down. And we'll go into a bit more of a truthful analysis of the current crop of mega bikes because they are mega money. Let's find out what the hell's going on. So let's start off with the biggest one, really, the SL7 Tarmac. It's kind of the most winningest bike in pro cycling recent history. It's very popular, specialises, a big marketing machine. They create a lot of hype around this bike, but let's see, is it worth the money? And let's think about what's actually going on. So first of all, they've discontinued the Venge. Were the marketing claims of that false? Was it not worth going down the aerodynamic route? They're saying that maybe the SL7 is a slightly less compromised bike and is a more all-round machine. Well, that may be true, but what I actually think they're doing is they're just streamlining the range. They're getting more power, more purchasing power to the supplier, so the frame factory in China or Taiwan. They're getting a higher purchasing power. They're getting more clout in that supplier. They're getting more exclusivity. And what they're doing, they're ordering more units of one frame, so they're probably driving down the unit price of that frame even more. They're getting more exclusivity on a production line, getting more clout with that supplier, and they're getting better return on the tooling, and they're getting return on the tooling investment a lot quicker. That's my skeptical overview. It's so similar to the old Tarmac and so similar to the new Venge. Take all the comfort, stiffness, lightweight things with a pinch of salt, because I really think this is just a streamlined approach from Specialized. And, you know, who am I to say that profiteering shouldn't be allowed? It's a capitalist market, fine by me. But I think that's what's happening. Higher purchasing power, lower unit price from the supplier being passed on to the customer. Is that saving being passed on to the customer? Absolutely not. The price is still astronomical. And we'll go into the motorbike comparison. It's something that's been done before. The price of a top-end carbon bike versus a motorbike is ridiculous. And we'll come on to that in a minute about volumes. Other things about this bike, they've gone back to a threaded bottom bracket. They're making a lot of noise about that, and it's a real pity because what they're actually doing is selling the industry's faults for profit. They're basically saying, well, our competitors and maybe us in the past struggled to make a simple press fit tolerance, so we're now going full circle back to a threaded BB, which we went away from in the first place, and now they're actually marketeering the fact they've gone full circle back to a threaded BB. And it just goes to show, it's an absolute pity that the bike industry really couldn't get simple press fit tolerance correct. And it's actually a more pure solution to do a press fit shell than have to do an aluminium shell bonded into a carbon shell and then thread it. It's more weight. There's arguably more QC risk because there's bonding of aluminium to carbon, which is notoriously difficult and hard to inspect with QC. It's very hard to inspect a bond line once it's been covered in epoxy. You don't know that the surface treatment's done right. Are they using a primer? Has the person done the surface prep right? You need to abrade it, you need to degrease it, you need to then prime it, and you need to get the bond gap correct. Now, with the carbon shell that it's going into, that doesn't have to be toleranced so well because you're going to have at least 100 or 200 microns of glue line thickness, so you can have the inside of the carbon a little bit scrappy, but you still need to prep those surfaces perfectly. And actually, it's not an easy thing to do reliably. If you want that bottom bracket shell that's going to be in a corrosive environment, it's going to have salt, it's going to have rainwater inside it, you know, the bike's going to get wet. It's quite a hard thing to do to bond aluminium to carbon and have it last 10 years. And you've got the fatigue of the cyclic loading as well from the pedalling torque. It's still not an easy solution. But what they're actually saying is the industry's really struggled to do a simple press fit tolerance, so we're going back to threaded because it kind of produces less problems. But in QC it's still difficult, so, and arguably more expensive. But it's a real shame they haven't managed to get press fit right, because all it needs is a simple go-no-go gauge to check the alignment, and it should be simple. And there are brands that can do it. Merida, Giant, Canyon to some extent have been pretty good at PF86. And yeah, it's just a shame we've gone all the way back to threaded, because threaded does compromise the layout and the geometry of the bottom bracket in the chainstays. Now, with a threaded bottom bracket, the shell width of the frame is 68 millimeters. With a PF86 bottom bracket, it's 86.5, so it's around 18 millimeters wider on a PF86. What does that mean? Well, you can have continuous carbon all round from the down tube and the chainstays and the seat tube. You can have continuous carbon width to the outside of the shell. That gives you a slightly higher stiffness in the bottom bracket shell. It means for the same tyre clearance, the chainstays can be wider, which gives them better pedalling stiffness. If you use a 68mm shell and have the bearings outboard, your carbon can only go to 68mm where it joins the bottom bracket shell. That means for the same tyre clearance, the chainstays have to be narrower, so you're losing slight bending stiffness there. Remember, the bending stiffness goes up with the depth of the tube cubed, so if you make them slightly narrower, they lose a lot of stiffness. Then you need to add more carbon into the wall thickness to bring the stiffness back up, and it's just not a great solution. Why not use the full width of the shell and have carbon going to the limits of the housing? It just is more of a pure engineering solution, and Giant can do it. I've had numerous Giant frames that have never creaked, PF86 frames, and it just seems sad that the industry told us that these were dead about 10 years ago and the future was preferred because it was stiffer and lighter, which it is, but now they're admitting they basically can't do it, so it's a real shame. Anyway, moving on from the bottom bracket. Tyre clearance is pretty good in the new frames, but that should have been done ages ago. You know, you've seen frames out there where the tyre can rub the chainstays and the seat stays, but they say it can take 28mm tyres. That's pretty pathetic, actually. They should have just made tyre clearance better many years ago, because the trend for using 25s or 28s came in ages ago, and now we're only seeing the bikes that can truly exploit that tyre size without rubbing and without too much, because, you know, it's all good measuring a gap, but when the wheel flexes and the frame flexes, that gap can come in, and it's only now we're seeing bikes that can actually accept the claimed tyre width. It's baffling, I know, but it's just a sad situation. So it's clever marketing, the threaded BB, but what does it say about the state of the engineering and production? Well, it's pretty shocking, actually, and it's a real pity that this is actually being used to sell frames now. And I hate to say that other manufacturers, they do follow Specialized, and they'll do the same. Moving on to the next bike, Trek Emonda, very popular climbing bike, very stiff, should be very light climbing bike. Now, what I'm going to say with all of these top end bikes now is that previously, some of the pro teams, when they got their Tour de France bike, they would have to add weights to the frame to bring the weight up to 6.8. And it was kind of mad that actually, if everyone was limited to 6.8 and they were riding production bikes, they actually had to add mass to the frame. So now what companies are doing, like Specialized and Trek with the Emonda, is they are optimizing the 6.8 bike. They're optimizing the pro team level bike, so the one with the SRAM E-tap axis or the Dura Ace Di2 and fancy wheels. They're optimizing that bike to be 6.8. And no less, because there's no point, right? The pros don't want to have to take a nice bike and add mass to it. So they've optimized the marketing bike, the top end bike, the $11,000 bike or $12,000 bike for the 6.8 rule. And then Joe Bloggs' bike, who might spend $2,000–3,000 on a bike, his bike's going to suffer and is going to be 8.59 kilos now because we're all forced to go into discs. So whereas maybe 5 years ago you could buy a Super 6 rim brake or a TCR rim brake for $2,500–3,000, like your Ultegra rim brake model, which might be knocking on close to 6.8 in a small frame size. Like my black rim brake TCR was 7.1. That's £2,500. Now you can't buy those bikes. Like Joe Bloggs, who wants to go and spend $3,000 on a bike, he's looking at 9.5 kilos. So for Joe Bloggs, it's a really regressive step. For the pro teams, it's a forward step because they've optimized, you know, they can add a bit more stiffness, a bit more structural rigidity in the frame and not be penalized, because that'll still be 6.8. So the pro teams have got a good bike out of it, but for the consumer it's got worse in terms of weight. Again, with this bike there's no rim option. It's a real shame, actually. The whole industry is forcing you to going down to discs. Like, personally I prefer discs. I live in a hilly environment with quite extreme weather conditions sometimes. If I was to live in Holland, Amsterdam or something like that, I would absolutely not want disc brakes, because if it's flat, you're just not braking that much, and if you are, you don't tend to need that much power. And disc brakes are noisier, they do rub, the pads sporadically squeal for no reason at all, and you can't stop it. They squeal in the wet, they sometimes rub when they haven't rubbed before. They're tricky in maintenance, the pads are expensive, and it's just not always a better solution to have disc brakes. It depends on where you live, and that would be my advice for that. But for the Emonda, no more rim brakes, which is crazy because it's a lightweight bike. Now they're saying with the new Emonda they've got the OCLV carbon update, which is their new series of carbon. We'll come to that when we talk about the Madone. That's quite a controversial topic for me. There's still no cockpit solution. In the top end SLR Emonda, it's a one-piece bar and stem, which is weird because originally the Madone had the one-piece bar and stem, and they replaced that with a two-piece option because they wanted the adjustability. That was a good step to go back to the two-piece, more modular cockpit. But now the Emonda SLR, we've gone back to a one-piece, and it looks like on the website when you're purchasing it, you can't adjust that. You can't say, actually, I want the shorter stem or the wider bars. You're stuck with it. And I'm going to say this about aero and weight and whatever. The most important thing about being fast on a bike is the position the bike lets you get into. If you can get your position, your body position into an aerodynamic and comfortable position, that will be the fastest bike. Not the little features on the frame or the integrated cockpit. Absolutely no way. So what are the chances of you getting your $10,000 US Emonda, getting on the one-piece bar and stem and fitting it perfectly so you know you're in the most aero position possible? Very slim. So I think that's just a bad move all the way around. And we see on the on the Madone, they've still got the two-piece bar and stem, which is more adjustable. So it's kind of baffling actually why they've done that. It's probably to bring the weight down, because maybe they found that frame is actually quite porky for a climbing bike with disc brakes. So maybe they did that to keep the weight low. Now, sticking with Trek, let's move on to the Madone. The biggest problem with the Madone has always been the weight. It's been a very porky bicycle. It's got large tube shapes. That's fine. They're probably very aerodynamic on their own. There's a lot of carbon there. It's always been quite heavy. And when you take into account the ISO-speed decoupler system, which I actually really like, that's a really nice engineering solution from Trek. It's very novel and it works quite well. Although they could have just used a skinny seat post and done away with a lot of the weight. What they've done with it is quite nice. They've kept that, and there's just a lot of carbon in the Madone, so it's never going to be a lightweight bike. But they've gone on about how they've developed the OCLV 800 series carbon, and they've said, I quote, "We've spent many years developing this carbon fibre." Well, I kind of disagree with that, because OCLV 800 is just Toray M40X. It's an MX series fibre which has a higher tensile strength. It's the same stiffness, so they can actually use a little bit less of it in key areas of the bike, which makes it lighter. And I argue they haven't done the work on that carbon fibre. I would say they're taking the credit for basically Toray. It's not their own carbon fibre. They don't make their own proprietary carbon fibre. It's Toray MX series carbon fibre. So it's a bit cheeky of them to say, like, we've spent many years developing this. And OCLV, if you didn't know, is optimised compaction, low void, which is just another way of saying we've done it properly, right? That's how you should manufacture anything carbon, with good compaction and low voids. How they've turned that into a marketing phrase is ridiculous actually, because that's just how you're supposed to make carbon products. If I had something with shit compaction and loads of voids, I mean, I wouldn't buy it, right? So OCLV 800 is just Toray MX stuff that's been made pretty well. Busting marketing claims. Apart from that, the 3D form of the frame hasn't really changed much. It's still a chunky bike, still probably a quite porky bike. But out of all the aero bikes, it's one I like the most because of the comfort you can get from that ISO-speed decoupler. And I've always said that the real serious aero bikes, the full-on aero bikes, always limited by the in-plane vertical compliance, which makes them uncomfortable. Now, I've said a lot about cockpits. Let's look at the BMC Teamachine. Now, this bike does have, again, an integrated one-piece bar and stem, but they do let you select the length of stem and the width of the handlebars, which is nice to see, because a lot of brands won't let you do that. We mentioned the Trek Emonda. I don't think you can do that. BMC, you can. I'm not sure about the big red stem. It's kind of phallus looking. Nice to see they've stuck with the PF86 bottom bracket, the press fit. They're confident they can do a press fit tolerance. It's really not that hard. In my black TCR, my rim brake TCR, I've got a PF86 bottom bracket. I've had that bike 4 years. I got it the month it came out. It's the TCR Advanced Pro 1. Got it in 2016. So I've had that nearly 4 years. I've never changed the bottom bracket in that bike, and I worked out last night, I think it's probably done about 25,000 kilometres on the same bottom bracket. I mean, in quite mixed weather conditions as well. And yes, I've taken the cranks out and dried it out and made sure there's no rusty water, but the Shimano press fit bottom brackets are so well sealed, they just work. So all you need to do then is provide your frame can provide the correct tolerance for it, the press fit tolerance, and then you don't have a problem. Although, again, the price is astronomical. I wouldn't buy the top one. And you're going to be again punished for buying the lesser models, because they're all going to be disc brakes now. So if you want the 105 disc brake model, you're going to be looking at well over 8 kilos, maybe even 9 kilos in a big size. Also, they had the fork recall in the last Teamachine. That was to do with the square back on the fork steerer. I always thought that was a bad idea, because the way the fork steerers are made by the mass manufacturers is that they're internally bladder molded. Now, ideally with a round tube, you'd mandrel wrap it, so you wrap the carbon prepreg around a steel former. But I believe most fork steerer tubes are still internally moulded with a bladder, like the rest of the carbon frame is. Let's say you've got a balloon, like a party balloon, you put it inside a cardboard box. No matter how hard you blow on it, no matter how much pressure you put in it, it'd be very hard to get that balloon to conform to the corner, the inside corner of the cardboard box. And that's the same with sharp corners in carbon. When you're blowing them up from the inside, it's hard to get good compaction in the corners. And I always thought putting a flat edge on the steerer tube was asking for trouble basically, and I don't know if that's actually how the recall came about, if they were failing there, but it's still not a great solution. I don't know if they've remedied or how they've remedied that for the new one, but I assume having had that recall they'll be fine on the new one. Lastly then, Merida Reacto. Now this is still a full bore aero bike. It's got very chunky tube shapes, high second moment of area shapes, deep fork legs, deep down tube, deep seat tube, so it's not going to be the lightest bike out there. It's nice to see they've done work with the compliant seat post. So they've got this little cutout on the top of the seat post. It's probably about 60mm long of length of the seat post, where they've really reduced the width of it to give it some bending compliance. But the problem with that is it gives when the saddle deflects over bumps, because of the short lever length, the arc in which the saddle deflects will be quite extreme. It's not a nice sweeping curve that the seat post will deflect in. It'll only deflect in the top, so the angle the saddle changes over bumps might feel quite odd. But that's just a small point. But to get better compliance out of the frame, I don't know why they didn't just slope the down tube. If they sloped the down tube a little bit and just got more exposed seat post, they could make that compliant length longer, or just use a skinnier seat post and have a much more compliant bike anyway. And that's my real bugbear with most aero bikes, is just that they're too stiff vertically. Now I do like Merida because, like Giant, they're kind of one of the more integrated companies. What do I mean by that? Well, there's very little conflict of interest between the production, accounts, sales, marketing, engineering, QC. It's kind of all done by the same people, more or less in the same building, in the same factory. Or you know, that's a naive assumption, but there's less conflict of interest. It's not a big Western brand with a massive marketing spend going to, you know, getting on the flight, going to China and saying, oh, I want this frame for $300 US, no more, meet the shipment deadline, and then they fly home. It's more family orientated than that with Giant and Merida. They make their own stuff in their own factories. They don't have that extra layer of margin built into the price of the product. Pest 86 bottom bracket in the Shimano standard. Now, Shimano actually have a bike building bible. It's like a massive technical guidelines book that any frame manufacturer will have, and they will advise you on things like tolerance of the disc brake mounts, tolerance of the dropouts, tolerance of the bottom bracket shell. And they advise for Shimano cranks to use a PF86 bottom bracket tolerance. Now if you go away from that, that's fine, but it's not validated by Shimano. So all the brands that do use that Shimano guideline, that don't ignore it, so I'm thinking Giant, Merida, Canyon use PF86, BMC use PF86, those are the ones I gravitate to. Now anyway, going back to this stupid motorbike analogy we put up at the start. Now, we were having a chat amongst friends the other day about how these top-end bikes are crazy, ridiculously expensive, and more expensive than, you know, a decent sports motorbike. And I was defending the bike industry and said, oh well, yeah, no, it's more of a cottage industry. The volumes are a lot lower. You know, there's not many sales in road bikes compared to motorbikes. You know, it's automotive. It's big industry. And then I was trying to defend the bike industry, and then I actually looked into the figures. I did some research, and don't quote me on this because this research is maybe not so comparable, but in 2015 in the US, motorbike sales across all categories were 500,000 units. So that's not that much really. And I looked at push bike sales, and I drilled down into categories, and I went for road / 700C. 2015, 2.7 million sales of 700C road bike in America, in the USA, versus 500,000 of motorbikes. And then my argument fell down pretty quickly when I was trying to defend the bike industry, because I said the prices are high because the volumes are low. And I'm thinking, okay, so we've got one even less leg to stand on now because of that figure. Now, I worked out the average price of the road bike sale in that year was around $600 US. So we've got a lot of cheap, mass-produced metal aluminium bikes bringing that sales figure up and bringing that average price down. So it's still not really comparable, and I couldn't really drill down into the real performance carbon fibre category anymore because I just didn't have the figures. But I have to say, I'm starting to worry about the way this industry is going, and we can't just use that volume excuse anymore. Anyway, like anything, I'm not against capitalism, not against people making money, but it does seem like the bike industry has got a problem on the whole with this kind of stuff. But anyway, let's not rant on about volumes and speculation, because I'm not that well informed about that. If someone said to me, like, I'm getting into cycling, or I want to take cycling seriously, and then they were a bit naive about how much these things cost, what frame should I buy? I would give them two options. I would say TCR Advanced Pro 1 or TCR Advanced. Both rim brake bikes. You don't need disc brakes, right? We had so many great years of road cycling without disc brakes. So many people enjoyed it before disc brakes came along. They aren't essential. They push the price up, they push the weight up, and they don't have that real purity of a rim brake bike, which is why if you've got a rim brake bike which you like, don't sell it, because it has such a simple purity. Even better if it's got a mechanical group set, you wheel it out the shed and it's just ready to go, and it's kind of like your old faithful. It's like an old dog, basically, like one that'll never die and always be by your side. I would say get the TCR Advanced Pro 1, which is about 3,200 quid, which comes with a dual-sided power meter. It's got Ultegra on it. It's all the bike you'll ever need. Or if you've got less of a budget, a TCR Advanced, very similar bike. It's got slightly less stiff carbon modulus. Doesn't really matter. You probably won't feel that. Again, it's got 105 mechanical group set. It's all the group set you'll ever need. And it's great value, and all these top end bikes are just completely aloof, and if you've got that kind of money to spend, don't spend it. Just spend it on something that's actually worth that money. Anyway, hope you enjoyed this. A bit long-winded, but that's my massive recap on all these crazy bikes. Cheers, see you in the next one.